Dr. Lee Scruggs. I'm faculty here in the Department of Educational Foundations and Leadership. It has been my pleasure for the last 12 months to work with Anne as she developed her research, and I'm excited that you are here this morning to watch her presentation for her honors project. Please welcome Anne Woockman.
Thank you to Lee too. But so like she said, my name is Anne and I'm a senior here at Wayne. I student teach next year and I'm majoring in elementary education and I'm getting an endorsement in K-6 special education. And for my research, I chose to focus on teaching students living in poverty, and I really wanted to look at if these students are actually getting their needs met in the classroom, and then if teachers actually have the tools that they need to teach these students. So my title is Teaching Students Living in Poverty, Teachers' Perceptions of Training and Implementation of Evidence-Based Strategies. So a little overview. First we're going to go into the introduction. So we're just going to discuss the problem of poverty in the United States, in Nebraska, why I chose this topic, and some research questions that I chose to develop to help me guide my research. And then we're going to look into the literature review. So what research has found, what strategies teachers should be implementing that are effective research-based strategies, design, how I created my research, how I collected my data, results, what teachers actually said through my survey, and then personal takeaways, just what I gained from doing this research, and then finally we're going to leave like 10 minutes at the end for questions. So introduction, we're going to go through the problem statement, the research questions, and then some strengths and limitations of my study. So the problem statement, in Nebraska, more than 205,000 individuals are living in poverty, and research actually shows that students living in poverty in the classroom, teachers aren't implementing or they fail to implement strategies needed to meet the individual needs of these students in the classroom. So research questions, the first thing I wanted to look at is, have teachers actually been trained in evidence-based strategies? And then where did they receive that training from? Second, have teachers had experience implementing these strategies that they were taught into the classroom? And are they implementing them? Are there any barriers that they feel that are keeping them from being able to implement them in the classroom? And then third, what their perceptions are, and like, do they actually find these strategies effective, and do they believe that having training over these strategies is actually beneficial? So some strengths and limitations. Obviously, some strengths is the ability to raise awareness about teachers and whether they're receiving training or education, whether they feel confident implementing these strategies, and their perceptions of the success of the implementation. And then to the schools I reached out to, it introduces them to those 6 of the most effective evidence-based strategies that I found through research. Some limitations is I reached out to a small pool of schools, so we don't have a large variety of schools, and it is subject only to Northeast Nebraska, so that kind of limits my ability to make any large recommendations or generalize for the whole state of Nebraska or obviously the United States. So literature review. So we're going to look over the definition of poverty, the prevalence of poverty, and then the 6 strategies I found. So the definition of poverty that I chose to use throughout my study is, it includes homelessness, and then it's based on the United States Census Bureau. So poverty is defined as any individual whose income is below 50% of the poverty threshold. So that would be $12,490, or any family whose income is below the poverty threshold of 125%, which would be $25,750 for a family of 4. And there are like different numbers for like a family of 2, family of 3, so on, but I just and then those numbers are from 2019. So they have changed a little bit, but not much. The prevalence of poverty, from 2019 to 2021 in the United States, poverty actually increased by 0.3% for families to 16.6%, and then it increased 0.7% for individuals from 5.5 to 6.2%. And then another definition that people use to assess the amount of families living in poverty is they actually look at SNAP benefits and they see how many families are receiving SNAP benefits. So from 2019 to 2021, the number of families receiving SNAP benefits actually increased from 10.7% to 12.4%. And then finally, I just looked at Nebraska. So I specifically looked at Nebraska has 9 regions, and I looked at Northeast Nebraska. And Northeast Nebraska actually ranked 4 out of 9 for the most individuals living in poverty, and we had 20,292 individuals. So the 6 evidence-based strategies I found, the first one was just looking at data to better individualize instruction and meet students where they are at based on their specific goals. Prioritizing literacy, so incorporating reading, writing, English language arts, and making sure students have a strong foundation in that before we move on to anything else. Having and communicating high expectations, holding students to a high standard, only giving them what they are capable of. We don't want to push them too far, but we don't want to limit them as well. 4th, teaching about poverty, economic injustice, and class bias, and then also analyzing the materials we're using, making sure there's no bias in those. 5, we're going to make the curriculum relevant to students experiencing poverty. And then finally, the last one is we're going to give students the opportunity to explore arts, music, theater, movement, and exercise. Design, so we're going to look at procedure, sample, measurement, and then how I did data analysis for my study. So the participant survey procedure, so 10 schools were emailed, and then through those 10 schools, they emailed me back whether they were interested in participating or not. If they were interested, we gave them a letter of cooperation, and they signed that letter of cooperation, which the letter of cooperation basically gave me permission to use or to get the emails of their elementary teachers so I could actually send out the survey. So then from there, we sent out a recruitment email to each of those teachers, and we requested their participation with a link to the survey as well. They accessed that survey link, and they got an introduction of what the survey was going to be about, and our contact information if they had any questions. They completed the anonymous survey through Microsoft Forms, and then we thanked them for their participation at the end, and we gave them our contact information again in case they had any further questions. So sample, like I said before, we reached out to 10 schools. We got responses from 3 schools. And so if we got responses from all 10 schools, we were hoping we'd have about 150 teachers, because that's about how many were employed at all 10 schools. And we got 16 responses on the survey. So measurement, we created a survey using Microsoft Forms, and then it included questions that connected with each of the research questions that I developed before, and so using quantitative data. So, and we also used skip logic through Microsoft Forms as a way to make sure that teachers weren't answering all the questions, they were only answering questions that applied to them. For example, like if a teacher had not received training at all, we didn't make them go through strategy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because they obviously haven't implemented them if they haven't received training. So the total amount of questions asked for each research question, for training we had 8 questions, and we asked questions such as, have you received training, where did you receive training, and then have you you been taught or trained on each specific strategy? For implementation, we asked 18 questions. And we asked, have you implemented strategies 1 through 6? How often do you implement those strategies? And then what barriers have kept you from possibly wanting to implement those strategies? And then for perceptions, we had 7 questions, and we basically asked, how would you rate the success of implementation? And then, is training beneficial? So data analysis, Microsoft Forms actually provided like a basic analysis after we closed the survey for each of the teachers of the raw data collected. And then it also provided data individuals for each individual question. So we went through and matched each of the questions on the survey to the research question that it addressed as a better way to help provide data that specifically answered that one research question. So results, we're going to go through the results for research questions 1 through 3. So research question 1, once again, was, have teachers been trained in evidence-based effective teaching strategies for students living in poverty? So first we asked, have you received any training or professional development? And we had 10 out of the 16 teachers say they had, and 6 had not, so we had about like 62%. And then we asked, when did you receive training or professional development? We had 4 teachers out of the 10 say they only received it through in-service methods. We had 2 say they only received it through pre-service methods. And then we had 4 say they received it through both. Then we asked, have you been trained or taught or trained on strategies 1 through 6? And the most trained strategy we had was student-centered. We had 9 of the 10 teachers say they had been trained on it, and we only had 1 teacher say they hadn't. And then the least trained strategy was biases. We had 7 teachers who had not received training, and we had 3 that had. So some summary and recommendations. 8 teachers that received training on evidence-based practices had also been taught or trained on the 6 most effective evidence-based strategies, which is great. So we know when we are training teachers, we are training them on the strategies that we want them to know and that we know work in the classroom. More training should be given to teachers on strategy 4, which was biases. We had such a low number of teachers who had not been taught or trained on that strategy. And teachers should continue to have training through professional development or other in-service methods. We had 64% of teachers receive training through only pre-service methods, and that wasn't even including the teachers who said both. So we had very limited teachers that received it through in-service. So research question 2, once again, was, have teachers had experience implementing these evidence-based effective teaching strategies for students living in poverty? So the first question we asked was, have you implemented strategies 1 through 6? And the strategies that were implemented the most were strategies 1, 4, and 5. So we had 100% of those teachers that had been taught or trained in it actually attempt at implementing it in their classroom. And then our lower strategies that weren't implemented as much were strategies 2, 3, and 6. But still, when we look at those, we only had 1 teacher who hadn't implemented it in their classroom, even though they have been taught or trained on it. So next we asked, how often do you implement strategies 1 through 6? And through this, we only have 3 listed down there, daily, weekly, and quarterly, but we also offered them the choice to do semesterly or yearly, and we had no responses for implementing it semesterly or yearly, which is great. We know that teachers are implementing it on a daily, weekly, or quarterly basis. So then we asked teachers who had not implemented it, who had chose not to implement it, we asked them if there were any barriers that they believed kept them from implementing it. And we had no barriers for strategies 1, 4, or 5, since all the teachers that had been taught or trained on it actually implemented it. And then for strategy 2, for literacy, the one teacher who had not implemented it said it was because of a lack of adequate training. And then strategies 3 and 6, we left a box for them to choose other reasons, but I didn't put a text box for them to explain what the other reason was. So unfortunately, all we know is other reasons. But we offered quite a bit of choices for them to choose from. We offered lack of funding, shortage of teachers or staff, lack of parental involvement or support, lack of adequate training, or lack of school/administration support. So we really did not receive a lot of barriers, which was great. So some summary and recommendations. A large majority of teachers that had received training also chose to implement it. So we know that our training is not going to waste. Teachers do want to implement it, and they want to try their best at implementing it effectively. And then on top of that, a large amount of teachers implemented them daily, weekly, or quarterly. They're motivated to continue implementing them in their classrooms, and they obviously see a benefit if they want to keep implementing them. And then when training teachers, reflection should occur at the end of the training to ensure that teachers believe they have had adequate training and there aren't barriers such as the ones that we saw. And then finally, research question 3 was, what are teachers' perceptions of the evidence-based effective teaching strategies that they have been trained and or implemented? So we first asked, how would you rate the success of implementing strategies 1 through 6? And the one with the black numbers on top of the bars are, once again, how many teachers implemented them. So that plays into this. But the highest one was literacy with 3.8, and then the lowest one was once again strategy 4 with only 2.67. So these are all out of 5 stars, which we put on the survey, with 5 being the most effective and 1 being the least effective. So most of them are over 3, which is great. So perceptions, we decided to ask teachers that had not received training whether they believed training would be beneficial, whether they've been in circumstances in their classroom where they think training would have helped them. And 100% of the 6 participants answered yes. So whether or not teachers are receiving training, we know that training is beneficial, and we know that teachers want to be trained. So a summary and recommendations. All teachers, despite not having training, obviously recognize the benefit to training and believe that training will help them meet the individual needs of these students living in poverty. Teachers that have had the chance to implement strategies recognize a benefit. As we saw, all of them except 1 were rated above 3 out of 5. And then more data should be gathered to determine the reasoning behind such a low rating for strategy 4. So finally, some personal takeaways that I got from doing this research. So Wayne State College actually offers a variety of courses that focus on strategies for teaching students living in poverty, which is great because I feel like I've been given a lot of opportunities through practicums, micro-teaching, and subbing experiences to actually implement these strategies before I had my own classroom of my own. And then, so like I said, I've been able to learn about all 6 strategies. I believe I've tried to implement strategies 1, 3, and 6. And I hope to be able to implement a lot more of these strategies or continue implementing these strategies during my clinical practice in Norfolk to better gain more perceptions of other teachers and see the effectiveness of each of them for myself. And then being educated on on these strategies will help me become a teacher leader, and I can share this knowledge with other teachers to ensure that all the students in our school, or my classroom especially, are receiving the individualized support that they need. And then finally, we just have questions. I left my email down there. If you have any further questions and are afraid to ask, you can email me for any further questions. Wow, that's surprising.
Your research didn't probably go into this, but maybe it did, and you just didn't put it up there. But as far as the families and children in poverty, did it break it down to how many were in a nuclear family compared to a single family? Or maybe it did.
I looked at didn't. It probably could be something you could look into.
Sure.
But yeah, the specific research I looked into didn't. Just looked overall.
I have one other follow-up question about strategy number 4 about the biases. How does a teacher implement that without creating kind of a class warfare in their classroom? Or maybe you never really researched that, because then by implementing or addressing those biases, then children that are from more of an affluent, they feel like they're the oppressors, and the other children that are from poverty might feel like, well, I'll never be able to get out of poverty. And that would be I think that's why strategy 4 doesn't get implemented as much as it would.
And I think that's a common misconception. I even had that misconception when our teachers first taught us about it. But I think there's very subtle ways of implementing it. Like, for example, like in our classroom library, getting books that talk about how some families don't have as much, or some families come from different homes. Stuff like that is a very subtle way of teaching about it, but not directly calling out certain students that actually live in poverty. And then the other major one that's part of that is just looking at the curriculum that we use and the curriculum that the school uses. If there is a form of bias in that curriculum, we can easily choose to just not teach about it, or switch it up a little bit so it's not as biased towards certain students. But I think it is a common misconception, because I definitely had it at first when we were taught about it too. But a lot more subtle ways to introduce it, especially for younger grades.
Aren't you glad you invited me?
Your research didn't show, by concentrating on more core subjects, that that does have a tendency to raise these kids up, and they excel better if they're more fluent in literacy. And I noticed that was one that was implemented quite a bit, which I was happy to see, because that is the way you will help these children to go on to not be in poverty when they have children. Those strategies, I think, are the most effective strategies.
Yeah, especially in younger grades. It all starts with literacy, and then literacy will help them build other skills that they need when they get higher up in their education, to hopefully help them gain skills to get out of that cycle.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, I want to thank you all for joining us this morning. And I want to present Anne with her honor cords that she'll be able to wear at graduation in the spring. Congratulations.